What is happening, boys and girls? Jim here, RCAD. Today is Friday, August 18th, 2023. We are out in the RC workshop slash studio. Topic of discussion today is obviously the Axial SCX 10.3 early Ford Bronco and having some drive shaft issues with this vehicle. Some unfortunate, unexpected drive shaft issues. So, this is a factory goof up from what I discovered. The drive shafts are just too darn short for the vehicle. Front drive shaft, in my opinion, is roughly 4 to 6 millimeters too short. Rear drive shaft is roughly 8 to 12 plus millimeters short. So anywhere between 8 and 12 millimeters too short on the rear, 4 to 6 on the front. I discovered this problem on the first run of the vehicle. Did a first run video with this vehicle a few days ago. And about a quarter of the way through my adventure course, I started having problems with the front drive shaft popping apart at the halfway point on the drive shaft, right at the slipper joint. It was popping apart under normal driving conditions, so it wasn't really doing anything extreme with the vehicle. Everything was done on video, so for the newcomers, feel free to check out, feel free to peruse my video library and check out that first run video. Yes, it's a long video, but it's a great video from front to back. You can see that we weren't being abusive to the vehicle when the drive shaft started coming apart on us. We didn't have a problem with the rear drive shaft during that first video or at all with the vehicle, but upon inspection, when I started looking at things, the rear drive shaft is actually more prone to pop apart than the front. So it was kind of surprising that we didn't have a problem with the rear drive shaft during that little first portion of the video. So we ended up getting rained out about midway through my adventure course on the first run. At that point in time, the drive shaft had popped apart on 3 different occasions. So we brought the vehicles back inside. I removed the body, flipped the truck upside down, inspected everything thoroughly, discovered, the short drive shaft issue, discovered a way to cure that problem, fixed the problem, put the truck back together, stopped raining, took it back out to the adventure course, was significantly more abusive to it on the second round compared to how I was driving it on the first round because, hey, it rained and everything was slick out on the adventure course. So we had to use a little bit more throttle to get over things, including, rolling on the power and then bouncing over stuff. So we were flogging it pretty good on the second round compared to the first round. And we didn't have any problems with the drive shafts from there on out. So our little cure fixed the problem. It's a nice, easy fix. Anybody can do it. You don't have to be an expert with RCs. Beginner guys and gals can do it as well. All you need is a 2mm hex wrench to remove the drive shaft pins, some type of measuring device that can measure millimeters, and any number of household items for the actual cure. All right, so before we get into that, let's just talk about Axial's deal here. I'm not being sponsored by anybody, but in my opinion, this is something that Axial should have caught on the design table. It should have never left a factory like this. For a $500 1/10 scale hobby grade RTR crawler, you wouldn't expect to have problems like this right out of the gate, especially for a reputable company such as Axial. So that was a little bit of a shock for me to have this issue with the vehicle. Nevertheless, we've got a nice little solution for the problem, so there's no need to go out and buy new drive shafts. You don't need to buy new drive shafts. This little cure will cure the problem for the most part. You shouldn't have a problem with them from here on out under normal driving conditions. It should last as long as the axles do on the vehicle, or as long as the universals do on the vehicle for the drive shaft. It should last a long time. That's the moral of the story, and it's a nice, cheap, easy fix. Getting into our whole repair here, I like to throw out a little disclaimer beforehand when it comes to this kind of stuff. Whenever it comes to working on your vehicle, you are taking that responsibility into your own hands. It's your vehicle, it's your tools, it's your hands working on the vehicle, it's your decision to work on the vehicle. Whenever you start turning a wrench on your vehicle or take a pair of scissors to your vehicle or start modifying your vehicle in any shape or form, that is your own responsibility. If you've seen a video on YouTube, such as this video or somebody else's video, and you've seen somebody modifying their vehicle and you like what they're doing to their vehicle and you want to do the same darn thing, and you don't follow their instructions exactly, or you mess up on something somewhere down the line, or you strip out the head of a screw, or you cut something a little bit further than what you were supposed to cut, that's your responsibility. It's your decision to work on the truck. It's your vehicle, your tools. Once again, that's your own fault. That's your responsibility. So I like that, throw that little disclaimer out. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply with this repair because this is a factory goof up on Axial's behalf, and we're just kind of curing the problem. So in all reality, we're not hurting the vehicle in any way, shape, or form. We're actually improving the vehicle. So, don't know if it necessarily applies or not. I mean, it applies to the 2mm hex pins going through your drive shaft. So if you happen to strip one of those out, hey man, that's your fault. I'm sorry. But otherwise, this is a pretty simple repair, and we're basically just curing a little factory goof up here. We're gonna go through step by step I'll give you guys a good idea of what's going on with the drive shafts, why they're popping apart to begin with, and how we're going to go about curing it so that you guys can do it on your own. So once again, you don't have to be an expert to do this. Beginner guys and gals out there can do this as well. We'll get our body removed, flip our truck upside down, and get a closer look at things. All right, taking a look at the underside of our vehicle, we got our front drive shaft on this side, rear drive shaft on that side. Zooming in on our slipper joint down here, checking out how much excess movement we have in that joint. Our upward travel, not so significant as much as our bottomed out travel, how far it is when it's compressed. And it looks like it's a good 10 millimeters right there of open travel, maybe 9 millimeters of open travel on the front. And checking out the back. I said in the back that we needed that it was about 11 or 12 millimeters short, but it's not, or 5 to 10 millimeters short, or whatever, 12 millimeters short. It's not quite that. It's closer to 7. We have like 7 millimeters of open travel here. But looking at our drive shaft ends down here, our upper end going to the transmission and our lower end going to the pinion on the axle, this end is a little bit longer than this end. So when it comes to putting in a spacer on this side or compensating for excess slop, we need to add a little bit more on this side. We actually need a 3 millimeter spacer on this end and 8 millimeters with the spacing on this end in order to get this to sit right. And on the front, we need 3 millimeters on each side to get the right gap, essentially. All right, so looking at our drive shaft, here's what's happening here. When the drive shaft is fully set in on one end or the other, whether it's bottomed out on this end or bottomed out on this end, it doesn't have enough material sticking back in on the other end of the drive shaft, and it doesn't take too much pressure to pop this thing apart completely. And that's what's going on. We don't have enough material sticking down inside the drive shaft. So what we want to do is limit how far this can travel. We have all kinds of excess room here. All kinds of excess room. Once again, roughly 9 millimeters to work with. So if we put a 3 millimeter spacer on either side, that'll limit how far this can travel, so it can't bottom out all the way when the suspension is fully compressed. And if it's fully extended like this, it won't be bottomed out in the shaft either, just because there's something stopping it from bottoming out, which will give us excess amount of thread left over on our insert here on either side of our drive shaft and keep everything held in place, if that makes any sense. Tough to explain. Back one comes apart a little bit easier compared to the front. Once again, everything is all fully extended, and this just pops apart. Well, not so easy. There we go. Just pops apart. And we can put it back together, which you shouldn't be able to do with the drive shaft attached to the vehicle. You shouldn't be able to do that. So that tells me that the drive shafts are too short right off the bat. So once again, on the rear one, we need to add roughly 8 millimeters down on this end and 3 millimeters down on this end. And there's a couple of different ways that we can go about this whole process here. Let's zoom our camera back, move our truck off to the side, move our camera over to the side over here, and take a look at some items that we have laying around on the bench. Now here's what I use. I have some leftover grommets, a whole bag of grommets that are leftovers from my Vatera Ascenders. Vatera had these little grommets on the ends of each shock, limiting the shock travel. And these little rubber grommets are 5 millimeters in overall width or whatever length, and perfect outer diameter to fit right down the center of those drive shafts. Now that's what I used. On the rear drive shaft, I used a full grommet and then half of a grommet. I used a pair of body scissors and cut one in half down to a roughly 3 millimeters. So a little bit more than half. So I used a 5 millimeter and a 3 millimeter on the back, giving us roughly 8 millimeters on the back. And on the front half of the rear drive shaft up by the transmission, I used just a single 3 millimeter spacer where I cut one of these in half essentially, and put that on the front portion of the rear drive shaft. On the front drive shaft, I basically used 2 3 millimeter spacers on either end of the drive shaft to accommodate for that extra space. Now I'm using rubber grommets. because it's simple and it's convenient and what I have laying around. But you could use anything as long as you can get that 3 millimeter gap on either side of the front drive shaft, and 3 millimeters on the upper portion of the rear drive shaft by the transmission, and 8 millimeters on the lower portion down by the axle. You should be okay. But once again, you could use a piece of paper and wedge it up into a little, make a little spitball and shove it down in there, and that would work as well. You could also use a chunk of wire insulation, and you could use that as a spacer on the inside of the drive shaft. And I think one of the best ideas to use for the drive shaft, it might be a little bit noisy, is to use a couple of screws, because this would be adjustable. Either a long grub screw or just a regular M2.5 millimeter. 3 millimeter might be a little bit too fat, but 2.5 or something smaller in overall thickness or diameter to put on either side of that insert, and you could adjust the gap accordingly to get everything right on the inside of that drive shaft. So let's pull the drive shaft off the vehicle so we can see exactly what we're talking about here. So we got our camera in position, got our truck turned around where we can see what's going on, using a 2 millimeter hex driver to remove the pin on our front drive shaft. Excuse me for shadowing anything here. I can't see the camera. There is our pin right there. Camera zoomed in, so it's hard to see the pin. Removing our drive shaft, pretty easy to do. There we go. We got that apart, and we've got the slipper part in our upper portion here that we have in our hand. So what we want to do is limit the travel on our insert here so that it can't bottom out on either side of the opposite shaft. So once again, we could insert something on the inside of the female portion of the drive shaft, like that rubber grommet, or a piece of paper, or some wire insulation. Or once again, my best thought on the idea would be to drill out either end of our plastic insert, drill a small hole down the center of each one of these sides, run that screw directly into the end of this, and then you could back the screw out to wherever you wanted the head for your depth. Now, these M3 screws right here on the side, the head on these is 3 millimeters. So if you ran this head all the way down to the bottom and just left that head sticking out on either end of this slipper joint, you would have the perfect size for that front drive shaft. Because all you need is that 3 millimeters with the gap on either side. The nice thing about the rubber grommets is it gives you a little bit of give. If it happens to bottom out on something, it has a little bit of cushion on there. Now 3 millimeters isn't too much. It's just enough to give us excess material on the female portion of the drive shaft, and it's not enough to bottom everything out. Once we get everything put in place, we still have room for this insert to move back and forth when the suspension is fully compressed. So once again, not hurting anything, just improving our chances of that drive shaft staying together by having more threads on the inside of the opposite shaft, by keeping this from bottoming out on the other end. So, tongue-tied. So, essentially, once again, we want to stop this from bottoming out all the way on our insert on either side. That's what's causing our problem. And once again, I'm using rubber grommets on the inside of mine, but ultimately, I think the best fix, the most accurate fix for this, would be to drill out the inside of this insert right down the middle. Starting right in the middle and drilling straight on down the center on either side. Don't go too far. You don't need much. You just need enough thread to get that screw to bite. Don't use too long of a screw. That way you're not risking blowing this thing to pieces. Once again, drill a small hole down the center. Run the screw in so the head's sticking out to the top. Head is a perfect 3 millimeters on this particular screw. Make sure you measure to make sure. And if you need a little bit more, you can back the thing out. 3 millimeters should be perfect, with 3 millimeters on either side, and the suspension completely compressed. The drive shaft insert still has room to move back and forth a little bit. So no harm there. And once again, this is adjustable. You could back it out if you wanted a little bit more sticking out on the opposite end. So there we go on that nonsense. I'm going to slap this guy back together on the front half. Pretty easy to do. Once again, I'm using a couple of rubber grommets on either end of mine. But if you're careful with the drill, you could drill it out. get your sizing right, and it would probably have a better repair with that. Once again, the rubber grommets I'm using starting at the 5mm mark. This one is roughly 3mm, somewhere around there. And same with the other one. So we'll get these guys put back in place. Somewhat difficult on the other end down here on the transmission to get this grommet in there and sitting right. I was using a screwdriver and installing these grommets, so my cut portion of the grommet was facing the bottom of the drive shaft, and our smooth portion right here was facing our insert. That way if it bumped into it, it'd have a nice little cushion to push in on, since this is tapered. So I wanted that tapered portion facing the insert. That way we had a little bit of a bump stop going in the opposite direction. So basically I was just installing this over the end of a screwdriver, holding up the end of our drive shaft and slipping this down into the hole, which is not so easy to do when you're trying to straddle a camera. But here we go. I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere. That's what she said. Alright, so we got that inserted. We're going to take our other insert here and slip that into place, driving that O-ring home, or that grommet home. I'm going to pull this back out and shine a flashlight down in there to make sure that we are sitting right where we need to sit. And yes, we are. Sitting perfectly where it needs to be. Get our drive shafts put back into place. I'm sorry if we're off camera at this point in time. I can't see what's going on. I'll take a peek here. Are we still lined up? Still somewhat lined up. I'll zoom in a little bit there. There we go. Alright, so we got that one half installed. I've got it kind of wedged behind our link here to hold that up in place. I'm going to take our other half here and insert our O-ring on that side, or our grommet on that side. Once again, using this screwdriver technique to get this guy installed. Trying to do this behind the lens and the camera, so that might be a little bit difficult to do. Get down in there, you pesky little bugger. There we go. And that's exactly how we want it, just like that. This part's a little bit tricky, trying to get this to slide on top of this without that O-ring sliding down. So you gotta kind of lower that drive shaft as far as you can down into the chassis. All the while paying attention to the position on your grub screw hole, making sure that you have that in a spot where you can line it back up on the axle. So trying to get this in a position. There we go. We got it back together. Sorry if you couldn't see that on camera. Get our axle lined up here. Now at this point in time, we've taken up a lot of gap on our drive shaft, so we have to fully extend our axle in order to get our drive shaft put back in place, which isn't a bad thing. We're okay at this point in time. It's not too much. If you had too much spacing on there, you wouldn't be able to get your drive shaft back on the other end of the axle up by the pinion shaft where we're currently attaching it. Now normally the factory would probably suggest putting a little bit of blue Loctite on these grub screws. I don't think that's necessarily necessary. These are crawlers and not really moving all that fast. So I just snug it up a little bit and call it good with that. Alright, so we've got our front drive shaft reassembled here. Let's take a look at their gaps on that slipper joint in the middle and see what we're looking at. Once again, we put a rubber grommet on either side, so now it can't collapse any further than that on either end. And if we fully compress our suspension, and look at this, we still have a little bit of movement on either side. Roughly 2 millimeters worth of gap there, 1 to 2 millimeters, which is good. That's okay. We still have free movement. That's the moral of the story. So we didn't add too much space there. And once again, when it's fully extended in the upward position like this, that's where it was coming apart before. Since our drive shaft is limited and can't drop down in any further than this on either side, it can't fully collapse. There's no chance of this guy coming apart again. We've got all kinds of excess material left over on the opposite ends to keep this thing held together. So there we go. There's our quick look at our front drive shaft. Quick, easy fix on that guy. Once again, right around 3 millimeters of space is what you need on either end of that slipper to get that where it needs to be. I'm using roughly 3 millimeters. Anything more than that, you might have trouble getting this put back together. Less than that, like let's say 2 millimeters on each side, might be too short. It might still pop apart at that point in time. I think 3 millimeters on each end is a perfect gap on that. And once again, I think installing a grub screw or a normal M3 into the end of that slipper joint would probably be the best remedy for getting that sizing absolutely perfect. All right, let's move on to the rear drive shaft. All right, zooming in on our rear shaft here. Trying to get our light to balance out. Out the new workshop slash studio, so yeah, still working through the bugs here on our lighting issues and all that other good nonsense. Trying to find a good combination of things that work. So we're not dealing with too many shadows. There's our screw pin removed. Sliding our drive shaft off of the axial pinion shaft. And separating our insert from the lower half. Once again, this portion down here is longer than the opposite portion leading to the transmission. So we have to add a couple more spacers on this end to compensate for it. And if we were drilling out the end of our insert and installing a screw in the end, once again, we would need a little bit more gap on the side of the shaft leading up towards the axle versus the part leading towards the transmission. So you need roughly 8 millimeters of space right here. 8 millimeters from the top of here to the top of the screw that you use on the inside, or an 8 millimeter spacer on the inside, whether it's paper or a small chunk of foam or that rubber grommet or some wire insulation, whatever you choose to use. You want 8 millimeters on the lower portion of the rear drive shaft going towards the axle, and 3 millimeters on the upper portion. All right, so we got that covered. Taking a look at our rear portion, we're going to get this guy installed. Well, should we do this one first? I think we should do this one last, since this one is hanging upside down. We'll get this guy installed first. Put our insert inside there to hold our grommet in like a musket holding the wadding in. And then we'll get our other half put together. All right, so once again, upper half on this one, I'm just using one 3 millimeter grommet roughly on the upper half. Get this installed on our screwdriver and ready to put in place. Come on, baby. She's playing hard to get. Grab our little insert here and get that slid in place. There we go. Yep, it's right where we want it. We've got about a 2 millimeter gap right there. It's not too bad. Gently set that down, move on to the other end, get these 2 grommets put in place. Once again, 2 grommets on the opposite portion, the longer portion. Alright, so we got this one ready to go, stacked up on the screwdriver. Once again, I think the screw method going into the insert on the drive shaft would ultimately be the best way to go about this and the most accurate way to go about this, with less worries about rubber grommets or whatever you just choose to stuff in there, flipping over and changing your inner dimensions. Alright, so we got that one installed. Once again, pay attention to which way your grub screw hole is facing so you can get everything lined back up again. Try to install this in a way that we can get this together without our grommet flipping around on us. Going from the underside of the vehicle and trying and hoping and crossing my fingers that we can get this pulled back through, which we did. There we go. A little bit more excess play on this one between the pinion shaft on the rear axle and the drive shaft. I got the drive shaft bottomed out right now, and we don't necessarily need the suspension fully extended to get this back together, so not too bad on our gap there. Get our grub screw put back in place. Snugging it down, making sure that we don't strip that baby out, because those can be a real nightmare to take back out. And take a look at our end result. Alright, taking a look at our drive shaft. We currently have about 2 millimeters on this side and roughly 2 millimeters on that side. Using 8 millimeters up here and 3 millimeters down here. With the suspension completely compressed, we still have a little bit of free play there with that guy. I'd say about 1 to 2 millimeters in each direction. We're springing back here a little bit. But once again, that should be enough gap on there to keep our insert from sliding down too far on either half. That way when she is fully extended, such as this, there's no chance of this coming apart. So we've got a little bit more material sticking in on the opposite end. So there we go, boys and girls. Once again, quick, easy fix. I think our grommet just flipped over on this one. Yeah, I think our grommet just flipped over on that one. Easy fix on this guy. I'm using rubber grommets. Once again, I think the best way to go about it would be to use a grub screw or a regular M3 cap head screw or whatever that's called. And just drill out the inside on either side of our insert and run that screw right on down on either side and back it out accordingly to what gap you want, which once again is 3 millimeters down here, 8 millimeters up here, and 3 millimeters on either side of the front. But basically that is our fix right there. Once again, whenever you work on your vehicle, you are taking that responsibility in your own hands. If you mess something up, that is your responsibility, but hey, there's not much to mess up on this project. It's pretty cut and dry. And it's a nice, easy, solid repair. Shouldn't hurt the vehicle in any way, shape, or form. If anything, we're actually helping the vehicle out in the long run. Once again, if you went to a brushless system or something like that, you're probably going to want to upgrade your drive shafts to steel drive shafts front and rear just so they hold together a little bit better versus plastic. But for the most part, this little fix right here should outlast the drive shafts. You'll probably wear out the pins on the universals before you have a problem with this. And there we have it, boys and girls. That concludes our DIY walkthrough on our Axial SCX 10.3 early Ford Bronco drive shaft correction. Repairing that little factory flaw from Axial. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video. As always, questions and comments are always welcome. And once again, this is not necessarily a modification as it is a repair. We're pretty much taking care of one of Axial's goof-ups, one of their mess-ups. And we're not hurting the vehicle by doing this. If anything, we're improving on the vehicle. So that's going to do it, boys and girls. Very much appreciated for you all sticking around and watching the video. As always, questions and comments are always welcome. And we will see you all on the next video. Thanks again.